Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Automating SharePoint Operations and Governance. My name is Dan Holm, and at our business, we've just created a finance site. And our new CEO needs to have access to the site, so we check real quick to see who has access to the site, and right now it's only me. So we're going to go actually create a request to add our new CEO, whose name is Satya Nadella, of course. Whoops, if I can type it correctly. To the finance sites members group. And we're going to submit that request, and we've got an SLA in place that guarantees that within just a few minutes, the user who made the request or the user who's been requested will be added to the site. So we'll go ahead and let that cook for just a few seconds here while I return and officially welcome you to SPC 304, Automating SharePoint Operations and Governance. My name is Dan Holm, and many of you know me already, but for those of you who don't, I'm an MVP in Office 365. Prior to that was an MVP in SharePoint Server for about 7 years, and prior to that, Active Directory. I'm lucky enough to, if I can get the battery here to work, I'm lucky enough to call Maui, Hawaii home, so I live about 7 hours away from here in one of the most beautiful spots on Earth that has a SharePoint community that you can count on the palm of your hand. So if you ever have the opportunity to come to Maui, please do give me a shout. I'd love to share my island with you if I'm there. Unfortunately, though, I'm not there very frequently because I do have a day job, which is as a consultant for Intellium and as a co-founder for IT Unity, which I'll tell you about in a moment. As a consultant, I've spent 20 years in the field working mostly with Fortune caliber organizations, but with some small and medium businesses as well. And the one I can talk about most openly is my role as Microsoft Technologies Consultant for NBC Universal, for whom I'm responsible for SharePoint and other Microsoft technologies during the broadcast of the Olympic Games. So I just returned a week ago tomorrow from Sochi, Russia, where I spent 5 weeks doing exactly the kind of thing I'm going to show you now. Working on ensuring that SharePoint operations ran smoothly, that everything was documented and governed effectively. I'm also a co-owner of the executive track here at the SharePoint Conference, so I've been lucky enough to work with Microsoft for the past few months, putting together great content in that track, as well as doing what I can to help ensure you have a great experience here. So are you guys having a good time so far? Yeah. All right, good. I certainly hope so. How many of you went to one of the parties last night? All right, yeah, I know you guys get a medal for being here, because I know some of those parties got pretty wild and went pretty late, so I'm definitely impressed. Thank you for being here. I appreciate that. I also am an author. I've written a number of books and articles over the course of my career, including the SharePoint 2010 Training Kit. But as many of you know, I didn't write a book for SharePoint 2013, and part of that is because I'm very happy to announce in just a few weeks we're launching a brand new content and community resource online called IT Unity. We're going to start it with SharePoint and Office 365 content, but it will expand to include other content spaces. And its real goal is to sit in the middle of the conversation and facilitate the conversation, not about technology per se, but about how businesses innovate and solve business problems with technology. And so we're really going to be focused on helping you solve problems, whether you're an IT pro, a developer, an end user, a business decision maker. We want to be there helping connect you with expertise and with resources that will help you achieve your goals. Myself and some of my great colleagues who are here at the event are going to be the voices in the community initially, and we look forward to having you join us as well. The site will go live in a couple of weeks, but there is already the opportunity to go up and grab your handle and get your username established there, and then we'll notify you when it goes live. So that's a great new resource that I'm excited to share with you. But the most important information on this slide is probably my contact information and the little URL at the bottom of this slide, which is tiny.cc/danholmspc14. And I will put that up on the screen again at the end of the presentation so that you can take more pictures or write it down. That is my SkyDrive for this event. In there is not only this slide deck, but there will be a zip file that will contain all the scripts and list templates and instructions for what you're about to see in this session. So you'll be able to download that. Probably, I might get it done today, but with my schedule, it will probably be at the end of the event. And I'm going to try and do everything I can to equip you so that you can put this into place in your organizations. The slides will also be available on my SPC. I know right now there's only one slide showing up there, but they will be updating my SPC very, very quickly. And last but not least, as far as my contact information goes, please do feel free to reach out and continue this conversation over time. Because my job, particularly now with IT Unity, is to help you succeed with technology and with SharePoint. So don't hesitate to reach out, ask if you've got questions, and I'll do my best to connect you with answers and solutions. So with that then, we're here to look at how we can build a framework for automation of operations to ensure smoother, more consistent, more productive, more secure, more compliant operations in our organization. And just to, again, sort of show you where we're heading, let's jump back up to our demo environment and take a look at the finance members group again. And hopefully, if the gods of live demos are with me, Satya has been added to that group while we were talking. We have about a 5-minute SLA on that operation, and we've ensured that it's happened. And in addition, we've started to establish a log of who has access to the site and why they have access to the site. That is sort of a hint at the framework that we're going to be building here. And the examples we're going to be using during this during this session are specifically group management and site provisioning. And while those are useful scenarios for us to be solving in our organization, the real point is not those specific scenarios and how we solve them. It's the way we approach automating operations, identifying what to automate, and hooking out-of-box technologies together to solve these business problems. And that's going to be our real goal, but you will get these solutions, you'll get the scripts. So we're going to put a spotlight on operations and policy-based management, ways of improving your operations in your organization and ensuring that things are governed and compliant. We're going to identify common operational pain points like group management and site provisioning, and we're going to discover how to connect out-of-box technologies. There's nothing I'm doing here today that requires a third-party tool to solve some of these problems. Now, of course, there are limitations to what out-of-box technologies can do. So there's no silver bullet. At some point, you might have to fork out some money to do something you can't do with out-of-box technologies, but you're going to see you can do an awful lot. And as a consultant, I like to encourage my customers to really focus first on the 80-20 rule, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that you can get 80% of the solution with 20% of the effort. And it's that last 20% that's painful and expensive. And so if you've taken care of the 80% and you've automated as much as you can in your organization, it frees up administrative effort and liberates that talent to spend more time on the harder stuff. But if all you're doing is clicking through the interface to create sites and add users to groups and push help desk tickets around, that's not really the best use of the really smart and talented people I see in my client organizations. So I'm going to equip you with the tools, the site definitions, or the template list definitions and the scripts that get this done. I'm going to give you some guidance as far as what you can do to take it to the next level, where this framework can take you and what you can do to take it to the next level. So let's start with establishing a foundation. We're talking about automating operations and governance. And so first, a very, very quick point about what I think governance is. And many of you have been to my governance sessions or have seen my webinars and training online. But for me, governance is a very comprehensive concept that takes you from the definition of business need through to the delivery and operation of a service. It's a very big thing that involves innovation management, change management, and operations management. And out of governance come policies related to information architecture, information management, service management, and application management. So governance is a big thing. What we're talking about is a small piece in this session today, is a small piece of it. It's the operational management piece. So, so just keep in mind that while we're going to improve that a lot, operations management alone is not governance. Operations management is just operations management. And you want to manage effectively, and you want to manage compliantly and securely, and based on the policies that your governance framework has defined for your service, but that's not all of what governance is. So we're going to focus on operations management. And in operations management and improvement, we basically need to cover a couple of main bases. We have to start by defining what it is we do in operations. So let's start with the idea of group management. If group management is the workload, is the operation that we're thinking about, we need to define what the input is. The input's pretty clear. We get a request to add a user to a group, to remove a user from a group. And who does that come from, and in what form does it come, and what inputs do we need from the customer? We need obviously the username and the group name, but often it's very good to get a business justification for why a user is being added. For many of us, under certain compliance regulations, that we have to demonstrate why users were added to groups and given access to resources. So we need to define those inputs. We then need to look at the outputs. The outputs being, in this case, very simple, the user is added to a group. And then the operational procedures that we actually go through to do that. out of box, it would be opening up the site collection, going to the little cog, not the one on top, but the one below that, site settings, site permissions, people and groups, that kind of thing, going in and adding the user to the group. We'd have to define that. Now, once we know what it is we're doing, we can measure what it is we're doing. And we want to look at what our SLAs are, and are our service levels what we agreed to. If it takes users 3 weeks to get a new team site, that probably isn't going to be considered responsive in most organizations. And I've seen organizations where it literally takes 3 weeks to get a new SharePoint site, and that's just a crime to me with a technology like SharePoint in most work scenarios. So we want to look at the SLAs we're achieving, and we want to look at the cost of operations. And not just the hard cost, but we want to look at the soft cost, the cost of how long it's taking administrators to do something that if we automated it, they would be able to spend that time doing other tasks. So we want to measure and understand what we're doing, and then we can modify our operations. Based on our solid understanding of what we're doing and how costly it is, we can then look at improving and or automating those operations. So why do we want to automate? Now, in a small group, I sort of asked for this as an open question, but here we'll, because we've got a big group, we'll sort of go through it. And the answers are pretty obvious. First, we want to increase efficiency. So we want to make sure that we reduce costs, we reduce administrative effort, and again, liberate that administrative talent for better tasks that require more brain power, really. Also, if we can improve efficiency, we can often improve adoption because the business sees us as being more responsive. If a business can request a team site and get it in 5 minutes, they're going to be more satisfied and more likely to adopt that technology. We also want to increase consistency. Some operations are complex, and in a series of complex steps, people make mistakes. I'll never forget, what is it now, 14 years ago, I was building the first Active Directory for us at General Electric, and I was sitting in the room with the 2 other colleagues from GE, and we were literally going through Active Directory users and computers and sort of creating OUs and setting certain properties. And we were 3 relatively smart people, and we ended up doing it 3 different ways as we kept doing it over and over and over because we just weren't consistent. It was a lot of steps, and it was inconsistent. And that, by increasing consistency and reducing error, that then allows us to have a foundation from which we can increase security. You can't really have solid security if you have an unmanaged, inconsistent environment. And so when we increase security, we reduce exposure. And I like thinking about these benefits both from a sort of positive what you're getting benefit and also a risk reduction story. Because depending on where your business is, you can sell administrative efficiency either by saying, look what we get, or by saying, look at the risk we reduce. You can either sell it on a value perspective or a risk reduction perspective. And last but not least, we can increase manageability. We can increase the insight into our environment. We can decrease sort of the chaos that can happen when people are allowed to do things their own way and use their own policies and procedures. So these are the reasons we automate, and these are fairly self-evident, I know. So now let's talk about, in a little bit more detail, what we would choose, how we then go about automating. We defined our operations, we measured them, and then we start prioritizing what tasks we want to automate. Again, not rocket science, but we want to automate things that are time-consuming. We want to automate things that are complex, because that will, in those cases, will generally increase consistency. That will benefit from the increased consistency. We want to automate and manage critical tasks so that they happen and we reduce error and reduce exposure. And we, of course, want to automate as much as possible anything that's related to compliance, to policies. And many of you have heard me say this, but my feeling is if a policy isn't enforced, it's not a policy, it's a guideline. You have to be able to say, this is not only what we want the service to be, but we know it's happening this way, and there's no way it can't be happening this way, and we're monitoring it just to make sure it's going that way. So if something if an operational task falls into one of these categories, then you want to prioritize that for automation. And then you can decide how to automate it, which can be with PowerShell, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, third-party tools. And as you look at the options for automating, you want to think about cost and benefit of automation. So the hard cost and the return on investment. And as you think about the cost of automating, think not only about the return on investment, the sort of ROI that we normally talk about, but also the other ROI, which is the risk of inaction. If you don't automate it, what risk are you taking? And again, by going to your management and your leadership with both stories, the traditional ROI, what we get, and the risk of not doing it correctly, you generally will be able to make an informed business decision about whether it's worth automating. So just as an example of a situation where I went through exactly this process, in the London Olympics, we were using SharePoint 2010. And SharePoint 2010's team sites had a lot of blockers to solid user adoption. The user interface wasn't as clean, there were configuration issues, and so we had a user base of 4,000 users, most of which had never seen SharePoint before. It was our primary goal to make SharePoint completely discoverable so that when a user arrived, they could just open up SharePoint and figure out how to make it work. In order to make that happen, we had to make a lot of changes to team sites as we created them. We had to make tweaks, we had to add users into certain groups that, and such. And I actually measured and found that it took me 12 minutes to create a team site, just clicking through the procedures and doing all the things that it would take to do it correctly. Now, the period of time in which we ramp up our users at the Olympics is approximately 7 days. We go from about 500 users to 4,000 in 7 days. And the number of team site requests that would come in during that time would mean more than a 24-hour day just creating team sites at 12 minutes a pop. And so it was really obvious that that was a time-consuming task, also one that led to inconsistency if I didn't do it correctly, that was worth automating. And the specific script you're going to be getting today is a derivation of exactly the tool that I started building back for the London Olympics for NBC. So this is the business process of deciding what to do. Now, how do we actually do it technically with SharePoint? Well, first we have to figure out how we're going to accept a request, the data points that we're going to get in from our business. Then we need to think about, does there have to be a workflow that approves the request? In some cases, you might have a workflow. In some cases, it might be the request is enough. And then what are the actual steps that you would have to go through to provision the operation? So adding a user to a group, creating a site. What are the procedures? What are the policies you have to make sure you follow? And what's the business logic? If this, then this at our business. You have to define those things. And then you have to think about how are you going to log what you've done. Now, logging is something that generally organizations don't do. They do the first 3 pieces here. They get their operations so things are happening. But when I go into an organization and say, can you show me exactly how your farm was built, what's happening here, what's happening there, usually there's this deer in the headlights look. And logging just is something we don't do. And we know we should, but there's other priorities. And we really feel the pain when our boss comes to us and asks us to report something. Who has access to this? Dan just got fired. What did he have access to? How many sites do we have? How close are we to filling up our SQL server? As soon as we're asked to report, to provide insight, or to document compliance, we suddenly can't because we don't have a log of what we've done. And that's where the pain of not logging comes in. So these are 5 of the major elements of our framework that we have to make sure we're achieving with a technical framework. So let's look at how we can map these to technology. The first, a request. What can we use that might have a nice form and a way of collecting data in a central location? How about this thing, of course, called SharePoint? So we can look at using a SharePoint list, obviously, to create the request. We can then use workflows, maybe something as simple as a SharePoint Designer workflow to manage the approval piece. Then we have to think about how we automate the procedure itself, which obviously can be done in many cases with PowerShell. That's the technology we'll use for that element. The logging, we can decide what to do, and in this case, we're going to log right back to the SharePoint list. So we've got the script that does the action will also do the logging, so it happens. And last but not least, once we have all of this information, we can use out-of-box tools like Excel and business intelligence tools to pivot the information and get the report, the insight, and the compliance that we need. So those are the pieces of the technology that map to what we need to achieve in this framework. So let's take a look at an example. And we already saw it sort of in preview form. Let's take a look at it in a little bit more detail. And the way we're going to approach understanding all of this is sort of like an onion. We're going to look at a very high level from end to end, from the request to the execution, and then we're going to go really deep into each element of it. So don't worry, you're going to get it all, but we're going to start by looking at the forest before we look at the trees. So we start with the SharePoint list to collect the data. You saw me do this at the beginning of the session, but let's do it again here. Let's create another request to add a user. Let's add Linda Miller. By the way, for those of you who are still in SharePoint 2010, The SharePoint 2013 People Picker is my favorite little itty-bitty improvement. It works so much better than the 2010 People Picker, where you had to know their exact logon name or you had to like enter their email address. Now you just start typing whatever it is you want, and it just finds it. It's great. Then we're going to pick the site. So we're going to say, okay, she needs to also go in the finance site, and which group she's going to go into. Let's put her in members as well. And then this is one of the other benefits of having a framework for operations, is you can start collecting data that often is important later. And in many cases, particularly in relation to compliance, business justification becomes quite important. So we've got the ability in this case to specify why we're adding this user to this group. And we'll say that this is her primary role. She's in finance. We'll stop there, and we'll come back and look at some of the other fields in more detail in a moment. And so we've got the request. We can see the request sitting there. And oh, by the way, the request is set to approved automatically. In this particular session, just due to time, I'm not going to build a workflow. There's plenty of workflow sessions. But the idea is you might have a workflow kick in that someone approves it, and then it changes the status to approved. I'm going ahead and starting with approved status here. So, so we have set up this request. The next step then is going to be to execute the request. So rather than wait 5 minutes, I'm actually going to run it manually. Let me set the font so you can actually see this. So I've got a script called manage-group.ps1. We're going to go ahead and run that script. And it dumps out the fact that it has looped through here, and it has added Linda to the finance members group. So let me refresh, and we should see that the list now indicates that that was completed. And if we go back to the finance site and just refresh that page, we see that she's now in there. And so the PowerShell script did the provisioning of the task. And if we go back, we start seeing that our logging has happened automatically. We can see that she was added. We have the fact that why she was added, so we're able to start collecting that information in a place that makes sense. And over time, as we get more and more of that information, the final step, the reporting and the insight, is just going to be as simple as exporting to Excel, for example, and running a pivot table to pull out the information you need, or doing something more complex and interesting with BI tools. And again, in this session, just due to time, we're not going to do the dashboarding, but you could create anything you wanted there. So that's sort of the high level of what's happening. We have a request. We have a script that's executing the request. We have a log that's collecting the data. Now let's take a look in more detail at the different elements of this particular request. So we'll start looking at the details here. This particular framework for group management allows you to either add or remove users. We're just going to stick with add as our example. We can pick a user using a people picker column. And you're going to get a site template you're going to get this exact site template, so you can just plug it into your environment. The site list, just so you know, is coming from a database of sites we've already provisioned. Let me show you that list. If I open up the site request list, this is a list of sites we've provisioned in this environment. And this is going to be the next example that we're going to dive into. It's more complex, so we're going to come to it. But before the session, I created half a dozen sites there. Those sites have been provisioned, and the group request is simply pulling in a list of sites that have been provisioned. So it's getting that list from the inventory of existing sites. We then pick, owners, members, or visitors. And again, you could get much more complex with these examples, but I'm just keeping it simple for the demo. A business reason, which is really just text. Now, one thing I didn't point out earlier is that there is the option in this script to schedule the request for the future. The default is, as long as it's approved, it's executed. But you could say, we're hiring this user in 2 weeks. We want to onboard her now. Let's get her set up, and in 2 weeks, she'll get added to that group. So the script has a delay mechanism in it that if you set the request schedule time, it will wait. Then we've got the status of the request. In this particular request, we're just going straight to the approval status. And the rest of these are filled in by the script itself. The script creates a summary of what happened. It logs the time that the request was processed. It puts the log of what happened into the item itself, and it indicates the version of the script that executed the request. And that becomes important as a change management tool so that later on, if you change the script to add functionality, you know what you've done in previous versions and can backfill the functionality as appropriate. So those are the fields in the list template. It's a pretty simple list. Again, then, there's a script that executes the request, and we're going to take a quick look at the way the script is structured. And again, we're going to go through this in several layers of detail. Now, if you're not a PowerShell person, don't panic, because the script is written to be pretty darn well documented, and it should point you to the things you need to change. And you should be able to plug this into your environment with very minimal changes. Open this up in Notepad, and I'll show you the changes you need to make for your environment. It's obvious. Change Contoso too. And you should be able to make this work. What you won't be able to do, if you're not familiar with PowerShell, is add functionality, change the script's business logic. That you might need a little bit of assistance from other experts in the field. But it's a really straightforward thing. First of all, I've opened the script in the ISE, the scripting environment, so simply because it adds color and adds other things to make it easier to read the script. You could open it up in Notepad. Everything that's in green with a hash or pound sign at the beginning is a comment. And so you'll see there's lots and lots of comments to guide you through. And what you want to be looking for, and what you'll be looking for are the sections that indicate there's business logic. These are the things that you will want to change. So for example, the domain name, the web application where the request site lives, and the name of the request list. So in this particular, in the group management example, there's actually very little you need to change. It's basically, this is my domain, and here's where I have the request list created. And the request list you'll create with a site template that I'll give you. With a list template, I should say. So in this particular example, that's really all you'd have to change. The way the script is structured is the variables are mostly up front, so you get the ability to specify what you need to. Then the script does the rest. And after the variables, there's a series of lines of code that define the way the list itself is structured. So we have the list back here. And let's remind ourselves what one of these items looks like. We've got these column names, and the script needs to know what the column names are. So for example, the script needs to know, what did you call the column that says whether you're adding or removing a user? In this list, we're calling it action. So there's this section in the script that says that the field labeled action is what we are going to use to define the action. And so the script basically points to the right column so that it can use that data, because the script's going to connect to the data and consume it and use it. If you don't change the labels in the list, you're not going to have to change anything in this part of the script. Does that make sense? If you change the labels in the list, you're going to have to change the corresponding element here. And similarly, some of these columns have further definition. So the action column in our list actually supports two different actions, add a user and remove a user. So the script also sets those as variables so that if you ever change those labels, you only have to change them in one place in the script. So again, in the script, there's this section of the script that is linking it to the columns. That's all that's doing, including not only the columns that are about adding the user to the group, that's these columns, but also the columns that are simply about processing the task. What is the status of the task? What time do we want to run it? What time did we run it? The log and the script version. So again, all of this is in there. If you don't change the list itself, you're not going to have to change any of this. Then the PowerShell script begins, and this is the part that's doing the heavy lifting. And the good news is this is the part you want it to change. There's nothing in this particular example that you would have to change, because it really is as simple as connecting to the list and adding the user to the group. So the PowerShell that does that is the command get spweb. So this is connecting to the website where this list lives. And then within that website, getting the whoops, sorry, I used the wrong keystroke there. Within that list, within that site, getting the list, which again we've called group management. And once it's connected to that, it gets all of the items out of that list, and it looks through each one to figure out whether the item is approved or not. And if it's approved, it then executes the task a little bit further down. So it looks to see whether the task is approved. Oh, and by the way, it also makes sure that the request time has passed. Again, the idea is you can schedule something for the future, so just because it's approved doesn't mean we should actually do it. We need to make sure that the current time is after the time that was scheduled to run the task. So that's that logic there. And then comes the heavy lifting, so to speak, where it brings the data from the list, so it takes all of the fields and puts them into variables that we need. So what's the username, what's the site name, what's the group name. It builds all of that out, and then it makes sure the user is a member of the site, and it uses the add user method for the group to add the user to the group. So, and again, all of this is PowerShell stuff that you don't need to understand to make it work. All you need to understand are the pieces at the top that are your variables. So far, so good? People comfortable with that? Okay. And then we make sure we run the script. Now, the script has to be run with credentials that have permission to perform whatever task you're running. In this case, in this console window, I'm running as a high-level administrative account. So all I need to do is run the script, and it will cycle through. And again, and then once the script has done the heavy lifting of adding the user to the group, in the process, it's also creating a log, and it uploads that log into the item itself. So, and we'll go into more detail about this in just a second, but it basically, there's a log that's been happening, it gets the content from that log, and then it puts it into the log field, and based on whether the request was successful or failed, it sets the status to either completed or error. So once a request is finished, as we see with Linda Miller here, we see the log just as it would have appeared if we ran the script in the PowerShell console, and we see that the task completed successfully as opposed to having an error. Now, the reason I put the log into the item is simply so that if something did go wrong, I have the ability to look at the script, look at the output, and see what went wrong without having to run the script again. It's a little bit of overkill, perhaps. And in a more scaled environment, I probably wouldn't include the log in there. But it's nice to have, and it gives me the unstructured, unfiltered information about what happened with this request that then later on I can go and parse into information if I need it. So the script updates, or sorry, puts the information back into the item itself. And I think that's it. Oh, I wanted to show you the log. Just so you know, so that when you're running this, you know what's happening. And let me clean this up just a bit, because I was doing some stuff this morning that you don't need. When you get the zip file with all of these tools, you're going to see actually a folder structure. Let me start up there. You're going to see a folder structure that starts with a folder called admin. And you don't have to keep that name. You can call it whatever you want. Within that folder, you're going to see a folder for group management and a folder for site provisioning. Inside the group management folder, you're going to see two files. You're going to see the list template that will create the list itself, and you're going to see the manage group script. When the script runs, it creates two logs. That's what you're seeing. So those are generated as the script runs. The first log, the control log, is the one where the script is looping through the items and just deciding whether to process them or not. Then for each item, it creates a request log, and that request log is what gets scooped up and put into the items log field at the end. So that request log is just constantly getting overwritten with whatever the most recent request fulfillment was. And the control log is the log of the most recent iteration through the list. So that's a little bit of insight into what's going on there. So let's turn back to our slides for a moment here and catch up with what we've done. So again, from a business perspective, we need to start with a request and the collecting data, and we used a SharePoint list to do that. Then we talked about the fact that you might have a workflow built, for example, a SharePoint Designer workflow that actually is the final set of business process before the request is approved. Then, very importantly, we have a provisioning process that is done with PowerShell. And PowerShell handles any business logic we need to. In the case of adding a user to a group, there's not really much business logic, but when we get to site provisioning, there'll be a lot more. And one of the policies that is important for our organization is that we log. And the script takes care of that, and in this case is really just adding data to fields in the SharePoint list. And then we've got the ability to output that and then get reports and insight into our environment. So far we've got a simple framework to add users to groups. Great. There's one big gap, as you can see in the slide, with what we've done. What's the biggest weak link for us to be able to accurately report what's going on in our environment? Huh? I broke auditing how? Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So he's proposing that I broke auditing. I would propose that I've enhanced auditing. I have a complete audit trail, including who made the request, when it was executed, and why the request was made. I challenge you to find that information in the SharePoint logs. It's different auditing. I'm not using the SharePoint auditing engine. I'm using a service auditing engine, right? But you're right. I mean, I'm not using the SharePoint auditing. If you went into the SharePoint auditing logs, you would see that a service account performed the task. But you also would not see why Linda was added. Yeah, so his question is, how do you then link this into the broader security perspective framework of your organization? Let's come back and talk about that later, because that's really a business decision. What is the other big gap here? What would ensure that our data in our list is not accurate? What was that? Yeah, people could work around the approval process, but again, you know, if we built a workflow, we'd make sure that it was solid and that was that the status was only being changed to approved by the workflow. What's really missing here is that we're not preventing people from going straight into the UI and adding users to groups, right? So we're not ensuring that every time a user is added to the group, we're collecting information about why, for example. We're not forcing them to use our tool. And that's one of the really key parts of a security framework, is that you need to start ensuring that if someone uses, if you've set up this framework, people use it, and that they don't go around it. And effectively what we're talking about is reducing or removing people's ability to perform tasks as administrators, and instead having them use it as having them request an operation as a normal user. That's what we've set up here, and then having a service type of framework that executes that request at a higher level of credential. So any user that has appropriate permissions to the list can make the request, but they wouldn't be able to then go in and add a user to the group directly. Instead, we have an element of the framework, one of the most critical ones, called the proxy. And the proxy is what goes and looks at the request list, executes it at a higher level credential that can actually perform the request, so that users don't themselves have credentials to go and do it on their own. This is a very important piece of the framework. And in this particular framework, as the gentleman assumed, I'm using a scheduled task to actually execute the script. So the scheduled task is running with a high-level credential that then has the ability to go in and make the change. So if we go back into our environment, that is the missing piece. Whoops. And in the background, there has already been a scheduled task set up, and I'll just zoom on it here for the moment, and then we'll look at it in detail, called Group Management, and that task is scheduled to run every 5 minutes. Actually, I have to refresh this window because I haven't refreshed it since we started. So it's set to run every 5 minutes, and that then becomes our SLA. And if we look at the way that this particular scheduled task is configured, the task is configured to run PowerShell.exe, and it passes to PowerShell the full path to the script. So if we were to be able to see all that, it would be the manage-group.ps1. So that's what the scheduled task is doing. The SLA is set up by the trigger. And the trigger is that we run it once, and that sounds kind of weird, but then we repeat it every 5 minutes indefinitely. So the way you set up these scheduled tasks really is you say, I just want to run it once, but then I want it to repeat. And the SLA becomes your repeat interval indefinitely. And then to ensure that the task survives a restart, under Settings, you check this little checkbox that says, run a task as soon as possible after a scheduled start is missed. And so when the machine restarts, it sees that it missed a scheduled run, and it just re-executes it again. So we've got the ability to specify what happens, when it happens, and finally, the credentials under which it happens. And looks like I didn't finish this task. This one is done correctly. Let me show you. Oh, no. I was looking at the wrong field. And this task is running with a credential that is effectively a service credential. In my domain, I've got an account called SP_automation. That's the account I use for automating operations. It has the rights it needs to perform whatever tasks I'm executing with that account. And notice it's set to run whether the user is logged on or not, because the user is never going to be logged on. It's not a human being. And it's set to run with highest privileges, which is this user interface's way of saying run as administrator. So that's the credential under which this particular scheduled task is running. And that then becomes the proxy. That then allows us to say you have to use this tool to get these jobs done. You don't have the ability to go in and use a backdoor, so to speak. And we'll come back and go into more detail about it, but that's the framework there. So back to our slides. In sort of text form, these are the key elements of our framework at this point. We've got SharePoint lists for requests and logging, a PowerShell script that connects to the list, consumes each item, decides what needs to be run, and then does the job, a scheduled task that executes the PowerShell script, and logging that we've built into the script. So those are the key elements. Now, when you download when you want to do this yourself, you're going to download the sample script, and again, I'll have the URL up at the end of the session, so don't worry about taking a picture of this little thing. You're then going to create a web app to host all of this. If you don't have one already, you need to have a web app somewhere. Let's assume you're doing this in your lab first, please. You create a web app, and then you're going to create a list with the template that I give you. Then some of this is actually related to the site provisioning, so it's not necessary. You're going to read the script, and you're going to look for things that say business logic, and those are the things you're going to modify. And then in the site provisioning example, there's a couple of additional elements that you'll modify. So we'll come back and do the site provisioning example in a second. Now, at this point, this is what we built. We've taken standard operations automation, we've mapped it to technology, and we've gotten the framework that ensures we've got the security separation we need, which is with the proxy. And we've used very simple out-of-box technologies to do this. But the pieces of this framework are exactly the same pieces that your most sophisticated third-party tools use. Whether you're talking Metalogix or AvePoint or any of the other security vendors or group management vendors, it's basically the same thing. There's a list that collects data. There's workflow. They've got a service rather than a scheduled task, but that's the proxy that's running with the credentials to do what's been requested. They're logging and giving you insight. So it's the exact same pieces with the same security separations to make these things happen. But while we're going to keep it relatively simple in this session, if you've got the skills, you're more than welcome to take some of these and pimp them up, so to speak, to take them to the next level. So for example, the request itself, we're using a standard SharePoint list and a standard SharePoint list form. We could, if we wanted to, use a more sophisticated forms technology. We could use InfoPath if we chose to. We could use whatever Microsoft releases to replace forms. We could use third parties like Nintex, for example, or we could build our own forms. And in those forms, we might use BCS and other ways of connecting to back-end data. So maybe we don't just have all the data in the form itself, but we're connecting to PeopleSoft to pull out managerial information and decide who belongs where to better drive our business logic. So we can take the form and the data request to the next level. We obviously can take the workflow to the next level by building a workflow or using a third-party tool to build workflows. On the provisioning piece, rather than using PowerShell, we might use some .NET. We might build a little application to manage this process. And if we do that, we might think, okay, maybe we execute this rather than as a scheduled task as a Windows service, or as a timer job, or as a service application. So there's several different models we could go, just different ways of achieving the same thing. And then the logging, we might, instead of logging right back to the same list where the request is made, we might log to a different list, create an inventory. We might log straight into a SQL database and start using SQL BI tools to mine that information. And as far as reporting goes, rather than just dumping it out to Excel, we might use Power BI or some of the other reporting and BI tools to get more insight. So each of these elements of the framework can be elevated to whatever you need to meet your business requirements and whatever resources you have. You can make this as sophisticated as you want to, but what the real goal of the session is to really emphasize that it doesn't have to be complicated. And these tasks like group management and site provisioning and whatever it is that takes your time up, you can automate them really, really easily. So let's then go back and go back a slide here and revisit the same framework, but with the site provisioning example, which is more complex. All right. And again, we'll take a look at this at the high level from the request to the fulfillment, and then we'll go look at all the pieces, and then we'll talk about how you can get fancy with it. So we have a site request list. We can create a new item, and I'm going to create a new site for, whoops, let me make sure I didn't already. I thought I might have seen it. Oh, I already have an SPC 2014 site. All right, so we will create a new site for the Las Vegas team. So we put in the site name. We're going to pick the type of site. Let's say this is a team. And again, we'll go into detail about what each of these things mean. We could, in this case, I'm collecting the business contacts. So who is it that's really responsible for this? And let's say it's our friend Bill Gates. And then we get to specify what types of information this site includes. And this is something that I've talked about in my governance sessions, including one yesterday, which is ensuring that you classify the information that you're dealing with in a particular container within SharePoint so that you can manage that information effectively. So in this case, this is really just an example, but we're asking users to specify what the Las Vegas site will have, and it will probably have some financial results, which generally are bad. And then maybe this also will have some confidential information in it. Then we get to specify who are the members of the groups, who are the owners, members, visitors, and administrators. And those are often different than the business contacts. One of the things that SharePoint I wish had out of the box was a way to say, here's who the business owner is, here's who's really the technical person as the administrator, here's who the owners, visitors, and members are. It doesn't, so we're doing that in our framework. So we'll go ahead and put, let's say, Satya as an owner. The members, we'll put Steve and Linda Miller. And let's say there's this guy, Dan Holm, who we're only going to give read permission. And then there's the ability to specify site collection administrators. We'll go into some detail about that later. There's some functional stuff that we'll come back to. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and process this, and we'll come back and look at more detail. Oh, and again, there would be a workflow that would switch it to approved. So now we've got a basic site request. We could wait 5 minutes. Actually, in this case, it's probably 2 minutes. The next run time is 9:50. Let's see. If we're close enough, we might actually wait. No, it's still a full minute away. So I'm impatient. We'll run it. So it's running now, and you can see the task is currently running. Just like our previous example, this script is generating a control log. The control log is saying what it's doing. So here it's saying that it's processing 8 requests, for example. And then the request log is processing each individual request. So right now it's in the middle of creating the site. The last line in the script is actually saying, please wait. And I know what the script is doing. It's creating the site collection right now. So we'll give it a second. And we will refresh and refresh. This will just take a second, or 30 seconds. Oh, it just tried to run this task on the schedule, and it saw that an instance was already running, so we're seeing that message right now. So that's not going to be as fun to watch now. So let's go back to the site request list, where our request was originally approved, and eventually here it will say it's completed. And actually, while it's doing that, let's look at the site as it's being built, because there's some points where we can actually see it getting built. Teams.contoso.com, Teams Las Vegas. So the site has actually been built, but right now the script is doing some tweaking to the site so that different lists are added to the site, different homepage experience is added to the site. So as I refresh this, you'll notice the Intellium logo just appeared in the upper left. Let's watch, and I'm just going to keep refreshing. We'll see some other changes happen. Watch the quick launch on the left and watch the center of the page. So that's the script doing its work. That actually, I think, is it. Because I see some lists that the script adds, like media. So I think we're done. Let's go back to our site request list and refresh, and it's all done. And again, we sort of sat here and watched it, but the idea is a user makes a request, and 5 minutes after approval, the request happens without you being next to your computer, without anyone actually having to intervene to fulfill that request. So the request has been completed. Let's look at the item itself. Just like our previous example, there's some logging that happened, and specifically, the log from the script is added in. At the end of this item, the URL to the final site is added. So notice down here, there's the URL. And this URL is what then is read by our group management tool. So if we went back to our group management tool, I'm not going to do it because it'll take too much time. If we went back to our group management and added a user to a site, we would now see the Las Vegas site in the list. So it's done its job. Now let's take a look at some of the things that the provisioning script did from a results perspective. First of all, it changed the user experience on the site. The big giant square tiles are gone, and now it has this text. I'll zoom in so you can read the text just perhaps a little bit better. It's basically introductory text that says, here's what you do to get around this site. And notice one of the things you can do is validate access to the site. You can see who has access. So there's a link right here that takes us straight into the people and groups for the members, and then we can check out visitors and owners as well. We see that all those were set correctly. We can also, of course, go into site settings and see who the site collection administrators are. Now, you might remember in the request, I'd specified no administrators. I didn't put anyone in the administrators group. But when we go in here, we see there are some. This is an example of policy-driven operations management. The script ensures that these 3 accounts are in the site collection administrators group of every site. Specifically, the SP_admin account, the SP_automation account, which is the script itself. So the script gives itself permission as a site collection administrator, so future automation tasks are already permissioned. And then an Active Directory group called SP_siteadmins, that if we have universal site collection administrators, we drop them into that Active Directory group. That Active Directory group is in every site collection administrators group. So the script ensured that those 3 things were happening. A policy and business logic was enforced by that script. So that was done by the script. Also, some features were enabled. So if we go in and look at our site features, yes? Oh, good question. How is the user notified that the site is up? In this case, they're not. I didn't build that into the script. But you can, with PowerShell, send an email in a heartbeat. It's easy to do. But the reality is my SLA with all the customers I do this for is 5 minutes. So by the time we've hung up the phone from the user actually requesting it, it's usually done. So that's just a piece you would want to build in. Yeah, that's a piece you would have to add. And in this session today, I'm not going to be giving you a silver bullet that will meet every single one of your business requirements. So if I did, I'd be so rich I wouldn't have to live here. I wouldn't have to be here right now. Yeah, but I'm just sort of teasing you. But the reality is that's exactly the right thought. What you want to think is, what does our business need for this operation? So at the very beginning, we talked about defining your operation. One of the things is notifying users that it's done. How do you put that into your procedure normally on a day-to-day basis now? How do you script it? So those are exactly the right questions, but in the demo, in the script I'm giving you, I didn't cover every base because I also wanted the script to be fairly readable for people who don't necessarily even know PowerShell. And so we'll see that. But that would be a good add. Maybe next time I revise this, I'll add that, because that's a very good request. So if we go in and look at the site features, we'll see some features were enabled. Specifically, the publishing feature is now active. The site is based on the standard site team site template, so that feature would normally not be on. there's one other feature that's on. Let me find it here. There we go. Open documents in client applications by default. That feature is active. And the broad point here is that we're using our script to turn features on and off. The specific features, again, are your business requirements. This specific feature, I'll tell you the story behind this. I was working with a customer who was rolling out SharePoint to a bunch of users who hadn't really used SharePoint before. They had Office web apps in place. And if you have Office web apps in place and a user clicks a document in a document library, it opens it in the Office web apps, in the browser. And they knew that would freak users out. The users were used to waiting for it to open in Word and see it in their rich client. So in order to make it work like those users expected, you activate the feature called Open Documents in Client Applications by default. So that then tells SharePoint, even though you've got Office web apps, don't open them there, open them in the client applications. So that's what that feature does. And again, the real story is that we understood our business requirements and we baked that into the process here. Now you'll also notice there's content that's different here. On the left-hand side, we have ensured that not only is there a documents library, but there is a media library, which is based on the asset library type for pictures, images, and pictures, videos, and audio. We've added calendar, task, and a discussion to each team site by default. And then there's this welcome text in the middle of the page. And last but not least, the branding has been changed just a little. You know that normally when you click the site image icon in the upper left, where does it go? Homepage of what? The site collection, right? And my experience with most customers is that that's not what users really expect. They expect if you click a logo in the upper left, it's going to take you all the way home. And so most of my customers end up asking that we change the behavior of this particular site image icon so that instead of going to the home of the site collection, it takes you to the home of the entire intranet, in this case, home.contoso.com. So that you can always get back to the starting point. It becomes like the start button on your Windows interface, like your button on your phone. And that's the way many users are used to working these days, is you start somewhere like your start screen, you drop into a work context, your app, and when you're ready to go to another app, you go back home and you go back to that other app. So exactly the mentality that we all use on our phones is what most users expect from SharePoint. And so I baked that into this particular process as well. And I'll show you how that was done. So those were the results. Now let's take a look at the script and take a look at how some of these things were done. Now again, this script is just like the other one, where it has a lot of comments, lots of green hashtags here. It has sections that say business, whoops, that's the old script. That's the last one. It has sections that say business logic, and you want to look for those, and that's what you're going to want to change to match your environment. The only difference is this script is a lot more complicated. It does a lot more stuff. So I'm going to go into some of the detail about what it does, but if you're not a PowerShell person, don't worry about it. This few minutes will be technical just so that those people who are interested can get some details here. So there is a section of custom variables. We're specifying our domain. We're again specifying the web application and the name of the list that has the requests. And then we're also needing to specify where we're going to provision the sites, the web app where the sites will go, the SQL server, and the default content database that we want to put these new sites in. The list, the framework I'm giving you allows you to override the default content database name, so that if you want to create a new site for engineers and put it in its own content database, you can do that. There's a field in the list that lets you specify the content database name. If you leave it blank, it uses whatever default you've baked into the script. The script also has a baked-in default for how big the content database can get, the number of sites it can contain. There's then some functional stuff, including the default template that's being used as a foundation here, the primary and secondary site collection administrators, and then the other site collection administrators. Now I want to mention this just real briefly because there's still some confusion about what these things are. In SharePoint, the word site collection administrators is used in two different places for two completely different things, but it's the same label, site collection administrators. There's the two site collection administrators, the two, and only two, that you can specify when you create a site collection, the primary and the secondary. Those are also the ones that if you're in central administration and you say change site collection administrators, you can do the two. Then there's the many site collection administrators, that when you're on the site and you go to site settings, site collection administrators, you see the list. There's the many. So there's the two and the many. Both the to and the many have full control to all site content and settings. So from an access perspective, they're identical. The to get email notifications, specifically if you've set up quotas and the site is getting full, or if you've done site collection, confirmation, and deletion, and it says, this site hasn't been used for 90 days and we're going to delete it soon. So there's two types of email notifications that go to the to site collection administrators. So, but the label is the same. Behind the scenes, the to are actually called owners or contacts. The many are called site admins. But the user interface uses the same label for both. And it causes confusion, especially because if you only have one site collection administrator and central admin, it automatically appears in the many. You add a second to the many, it adds it to the secondary. And the user interface is hooked together in ways that really confound it. Bottom line is you've got the many and the to. The only difference between them is the email notifications about quotas and site use confirmation and deletion. How you approach security is completely up to you, and on Thursday I'll go through my bottom line definition, but my recommendation is that the two are just basically service accounts. And you'll see I've got that here. The SP_admin account and the SP_automation account are the primary and secondary for every site collection. So there's not a human being per se that is a primary or secondary site collection administrator. The only loss that I suffer from that is that the emails don't go to human beings, but if I put a human being's email account as the email account for these accounts, it does go to a human being. And I maybe put it into a shared inbox where all my SharePoint administrators can see what's going on. So I lose a little bit of fidelity on those two email notifications, but my feeling is I should be monitoring site size and site use as a separate framework, not using SharePoint's out-of-box tool. I don't find it rich enough for me. And then on the many, you can put groups in there. The two can only be users, but the many can be a group. And so I'm putting the Active Directory group, SP_site_admins, into the Site Collection Administrators group so that now my human beings that need to be Site Collection Administrators for my whole environment, I can drop them once into an Active Directory group. So that's what I've done there, just so you know. Again, this is part of the business logic. Then there's some branding that we will talk about more in just a moment. Sorry? You can absolutely use custom templates, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but all you'd have to do is refer to your custom template, and you could use whatever you want to. There's no reason not to. And I'll come back and talk about that more in just a second. So going down here, we've just done Site Collection Administrators. We'll come back and talk about branding a bit more. And then the script does its job. These are all the column assignments. Again, the script says this column has the information we need so that it can connect and get the information. If you don't change the list, you don't have to change these fields. And then the script does the connection to the site and starts looping through. So for each request, it again looks at each request. It figures out whether the request is approved and the time has passed. And then it actually executes the request. So there is a little bit of business logic at the beginning of the execution. And let me point those things out to you. First, there is some business logic about what happens if you leave fields blank in the list. In the list, you're required to specify the site name, and that becomes the last part of the URL. You're not required to specify the site title, which shows up in big letters in the homepage, and you're not required to specify a description. If you leave those two things blank, it basically just takes the site name and puts them into the lower levels. So that's a little bit of business logic you might choose to change. And you can see that here, and it's all commented. If the title is blank, we just use the website as the website name. Going down here a little bit further, there's some business logic about the URL for the site. And let me show you this back in our list. So when we make a site request, we are asked to choose between a department, a team, a project, a site, or an app. Now, in this particular demo, and this is described right underneath the field, all this does is determine the URL. So if you say it's a team site, a department site, it's going to be teams.contoso.com/depts/ whatever your site name is. So it's just creating the namespace for the site collection. Because of that, and this is in the instructions that you're getting on the slide deck, you have to make sure your web application has these as managed paths. If you want to have different managed paths, create them in your web application, change them on the form, and then you would need to change them in the script as well. So there's this part in the script that's basically saying, if I picked a department site, then the web app URL is going to be the main web app, the managed path is going to be departments, and it does that for each other one. So if it's a project, then the managed path is projects, and it builds the URL based on that. Super simple logic, just to demonstrate that you can take information from the list and make decisions about where it goes. You might choose that department sites and project sites go into two completely different web applications. That might be your logic. Whatever it is, you can prove that logic here. There's also on the list itself, there's a way, as I mentioned, to override the content database name. So down here, we can see that you can enter the content database name of your choice, and if you leave it blank, the default is used. You can also specify the quota. This is another really critical governance control that I would bet 98% of the people in this room don't put on their team sites. And let's be honest. How many of you don't put quotas on your team sites? Okay, it's better than 98%, but still a lot. For those of you, and some of you I know aren't raising your hands. For those of you who don't, keep in mind that the default quota is infinite. What is preventing a user from dragging and dropping the contents of their C drive into your team site? And is your SQL infrastructure ready for that 500 gigabyte hard drive on their laptop? I mean, that's the risk you're taking. That is a risk, and you should have a policy about that. And quotas are the right way to do that. And so this framework includes the ability to set a quota as well. Another example of a policy. So we've got the quota. There's also in the script the ability to set permissions. I've already shown you that we can specify who's in the owners, members, and visitors groups. In addition, there's a couple of checkboxes here that allow you to specify whether you give all authenticated users read access. In other words, the authenticated user's identity goes into the visitors group, or do you give true anonymous access, in which case you also have to have anonymous access enabled on the web application. So both of those are available. I have some clients where there are certain team sites where they want anyone to be able to read, but the team is the only one that can make changes, so I made that easy. And then in the list, there's the option to specify some of the different things we're adding to the team site. The welcome text, the different lists that we're adding and making sure exist. And then notice down towards the bottom, there's remove site contents and remove recent. Let me show you what that does. Notice in Las Vegas, there is not the site contents link. I really don't like the site contents link because what the site contents link shows you is this big list of things, many of which users have no business seeing or working with, and it confuses them. And so my rule, from a governance perspective, is if normal users are going to need something, it should be in the navigation. They shouldn't have to go to site contents to get to it. If there's an administrative list that only certain users need to get to, it's a back-end thing that maybe feeds drop-down lists or whatever, then I'd show those users how to go to site contents and get to the list. But normal users, everything they need is out there, no site contents. I also often will take out the recent list, which basically when you add a new list, it goes under this category called recent, because that then is there for a little while and then it vanishes, and everyone wonders where it is. So I'm not a big fan of that. Again, I hardwire the navigation so that it's usable for users. Yeah. No, the framework I'm giving you has no difference other than the URL between team sites and department sites. You could certainly bake in that logic, but I only pick the URL. Yeah, if you want to implement a difference between, say, team sites and department sites, you could do it either in the script entirely, or you could do it with a separate template for each, and then the script would simply say, if I chose department, use this template. If I chose project, use this template. So you would have something in the script to do no matter what, because the script is going to have to pick the template, or the script is going to have to take one template and make multiple tweaks to it. And let me go through this a little bit more, because we're going to run out of time. So I'm not going to go through all the heavy lifting, but I'll show you. It adds all the users to the site collection administrators. It adds users to members and visitors. That's all happening in there. It goes through the process of enabling features. So this is a little bit of business logic here. In fact, I'm going to make a note here for business logic. I forgot to flag this one for you. So there's some business logic about what features are getting enabled. Then there's the decision about if we want a media library, for example. This is looking at that, and it adds it. Blah, blah, blah. Modifying the quick launch and taking off recent and site contents. And then very importantly, because this is going to be something you'll want to take a look at, the way I've dealt with branding in this particular example. Now I understand there's lots of ways to do branding, and this is not the slickest way to do it, but I did this for very specific reasons. The way the branding works is that in the folder I'm going to give you, in the zip file, there will be right where the script is, so here's our script, there is a subfolder called branding. In that subfolder, there is an icon, an image called Site Image Icon. All you have to do is replace that with your company's logo and use the same name. It's a PNG file, and it will appear in the upper left. And then there are two masters. There's an HTML and an ASPX master page. And these are the only thing that's different between these and the standard template in SharePoint is the fact that when you click the link in the upper left, it takes you to the home page of your entire intranet. So if you want to leverage that functionality, this is something you're going to have to change. You're just going to open this up in Notepad, for example. Let me set it big enough that you can actually see it. And you're going to search for contoso.com. So I'm going to Control F, Contoso. And this will show you exactly where, and there's, I think, 2 spots where you'll see it, home.contoso.com. Set that to the URL of your home page, and that's the change you need to make for that. The final step of all of this is the scheduled task, and I've shown you the properties of the scheduled task, which again, for site provisioning, is going to be an action that runs PowerShell with the script itself, a trigger that triggers the action to occur one time, but then to repeat based on your SLA for an indefinite period of time, a setting that says restart this if a scheduled start is missed, and then setting the credentials that the task runs under, being sure to specify that the task should run whether the user is logged on or not and run as administrator. Going back to our slides. So with the site provisioning, you're again going to take the zip file I give you, you're going to create a web app, you're going to make sure it has the managed paths it needs, so that's a little bit different from the group. You're going to create a list with the template. You're going to create quotas so that you can apply them. The names I've used are team site-standard and team site-large. You can create different quotas and just change it in the script. Oh no, you only have to change it in the form. The drop-down list in the form has to have the same options that you've actually created in your SharePoint farm. Read the script looking for places that are flagged as business logic. And then you'll need to modify the script for your business logic and also the master page. Specifically, look for things that say contoso.com and replace those with the URL to your homepage. That then will give you exactly what I've done working in your environment, and from that point forward, you can start adding custom configuration, whether it's multiple templates, whether it's email notifications, whatever it might be. I've shown you how to do this particular task of site provisioning completely with PowerShell. That, again, is not the only way to do it. You can use any of the pimping up methods that we talked about earlier, including .NET applications, custom templates, custom solutions to deploy these things. But I wanted to do it with PowerShell, first of all, because this is an IT Pro session. I wanted to ensure we were using only IT Pro tools. You do not have to open up Visual Studio to do anything that we did. If you can open Visual Studio and create a site definition that then takes away the need to brand it with PowerShell, please do. That's certainly a better way to do it. But I wanted to keep it with IT Pro tools here. And I also wanted to show you that you can do a lot with PowerShell that a lot of people think, oh, to brand it, you have to use Visual Studio. You don't have to. You can't do everything in PowerShell, but you can do a lot. So I wanted to use IT Pro tools. I wanted to show you what was possible. And remember that even if you create the best templates in the world and site definitions, every new site you create will have some unique things. Who goes into the administrators group? Who goes into the members, owners, and visitors groups? There's always going to be unique instance-specific properties that you have to set as you provision a specific site in your organization. So there will be some PowerShell involved, even if you're shortening the script with some other capabilities. And last but not least, site provisioning itself can be done with additional tools even outside of PowerShell. Yesterday, they showed us the Compose app, where a user could request a site right in an email message, and then a custom-built application and framework could provision the sites. That's possible. There are third-party tools that do site provisioning. And that's one of the last points I want to make here, is that what I've given you will work. and it will do a lot. And I actually have some of the biggest companies in the world using my dorky little framework of PowerShell and scheduled tasks to do some pretty significant operations on a day-to-day basis. So it works, and it's not necessarily a silver bullet. It's not the slickest way to do it in the world. It may not meet everyone's business requirements, but it does work, and it's secure, and it's the right framework. There's a reason, though, why that exhibit hall is filled with vendors. There are things that they can do that align better with your business requirements, that are richer, that give you better insight and reporting and auditing and capabilities. Please know what those tools do, because you're probably going to need some of them. You're going to need a good backup and restore tool in a SharePoint farm. You're probably going to need a really good security management and auditing tool. So know what's out there so you can make an intelligent decision about whether it even makes sense for you to build a framework like this for a specific operation, or whether you should buy a third-party tool for that operation and use a framework like this for other operations. And mix and match. But don't sit there feeling like every operation that's painful and time-consuming is something you have to do manually or your team has to do manually every single day. Take the opportunity to step back and decide what is worth automating in your environment, so you can do better and do more in your SharePoint farm. So to wrap up, I'll leave this slide up. This is the one that if you want to grab a picture of the URL, this will probably be the best one. It's the same as all my other sessions as well, tiny.cc/danholmspc14. It is all lowercase. Tiny is case sensitive. All of the information that I've shown you here, the slides, the script, the site definitions, I will put into a zip file again, if I can do it as soon as possible. Chances are it'll probably be later this week. Later on this month, we're going to go live with itunity.com, and I will be extending these solutions as part of what I write about on itunity.com, because again, our goal is really to take challenges that IT pros, developers, business users, and business leaders are trying to solve, and help you solve those problems. So we'll have content like this up there. Please join us at IT Unity in the future, and most importantly, enjoy the rest of SharePoint Conference. I'll see some of you on Thursday and some of you around the exhibit halls. Have a great morning.